Hi, welcome back to another day in Treaties Recognition Week in 2023. My name is Mary Musqua Culbertson. I am the Treaty Commissioner for Saskatchewan. I am from Kizakus First Nation in Treaty 4. Breaches of treaty almost started immediately. When our ancestors negotiated to the depth of a plow, as we can see today when we look around at all the development on these lands around us through oil, through mining, drilling, contamination of the land, we see that's not the case today. Other breaches of treaty, we can look at healthcare. When our ancestors negotiated the medicine chest clause, the First Nations' intention was that it would be their healthcare needs. The government determined that the definition of that would be a medicine chest with band-aids and so forth, kept at the Indian agent's house. That is not the intention. Today, when we look at the healthcare system and some of the myths that surround First Nations people, like we get everything for free as First Nations, that we don't pay tax, that we get free education, all of that is not true. First Nations pay tax. We only are exempt if you're a status Indian under the Indian Act. The Indian Act itself was not agreed to in treaty. It wasn't part of treaty. It wasn't in place until 1876. Lieutenant Governor Laird, his department created the Indian Act, and then he was appointed Lieutenant Governor of what was called the Northwest Territories, which is where we live now. So at treaty, when our ancestors intended that there'd be relief in times of famine and pestilence, they meant that healthcare aspect, we would always be looked after, we'd be taken care of. Along with newcomers and new populations being introduced together, came diseases that First Nations, Indigenous people were not immune to. There was widespread First Nations people were not immune to many of these diseases. There was widespread epidemics, and today, to me, I see that as translated into something else. We look around today and we see so many tragedies in our society. We have opioid crisis, and it's not just First Nations people suffering from this crisis in these territories. It's non-First Nations as well. We have this epidemic of drugs that we need to combat, and we need our governments to help us in our nations, in our communities, in our rural areas, in our cities, our towns, to fight this epidemic. First Nations people have such high rates of health disparities, and yet we are such a small portion of the population. There's approximately 160,000 First Nations status Indians in this province of Saskatchewan. And remember, I mentioned the Indian Act and status. When our ancestors entered into treaty, they didn't say, I will determine, right? The commissioner did not say, we will create an Indian Act and it's going to tell you who your own people are. That was never a discussion. That promise was never made. We were to be able to keep who we were, our culture, our language, and that was the ability to say who our treaty people were. And instead, we got an Indian Act that was there taking away the Indian identity from our mothers, from our grandmothers. My own mother was no longer considered an Indian within the meaning of the Indian Act when she married my father in 1971. And it wasn't until 1982 when the Canadian Constitution, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, was enacted that First Nations people, women, Indigenous women, were able to challenge the Indian Act as discriminatory. It was challenged on the basis of it being sexual discrimination against First Nations women, and it was successful. So they amended the Indian Act. And to this day, there's still just amendments after amendments, and the Indian Act still determines who our people are. No other race in this country is told by the government who they are. Part of those breaches of treaty, I mentioned before about residential schools, the broken treaty promise of education, and instead we got residential schools. Those residential schools were written as mandatory into the Indian Act. Mandatory meaning the Northwest Mounted Police, which is now the RCMP, were mandated by a piece of legislation to remove children from their parents, from their homes, from their communities, and put them in residential schools as young as 4 years old. My mother is a residential school survivor and a day school survivor. Most of my family, my close relatives, my cousins, my aunts, my uncles, all went to residential school. The last residential school closed in this province in 1997. Today, we hear many announcements of unmarked graves. The first announcement was made in May of 2021. For years, our survivors, elders, had been talking about their experiences. They were able to talk about these experiences through an amazing commission called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In May 2021, when Kamloops made the announcement about ground penetrating radar results and the unmarked graves that they had found there of children, the whole world was now listening and watching and believing our survivors, believing our stories, our oral histories, our elders. As a First Nations woman, I'm from Kizikus First Nation. In our community, there is St. Philip's. That was the last residential school that had been open there. There was more, however, Fort Pelly, the Crow Stand. So we always heard these stories. We knew these things, but it wasn't believed. And with the revelation at Kamloops, it made the whole world pay attention again. So those truths are coming out again, and the work is ongoing, and we'll be going through this for a while. It'll be some time before all the truth comes out, but it's there. And nobody can deny acts of genocide now that happened because of a broken treaty promise.